guys. Welcome to episode 18 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, we're going to mix up the style a little bit. Today, we're going to go through a lightning round Q&A. We got some Instagram questions from last week. Josh and I have not looked at these super closely, so it's just kind of going to be off-the-cuff answers, a little bit less nuanced than generally, but it's going to be fun to kind of go through a few more topics than we generally have time to cover. So, without further ado, Mr. Pellin, the first question we have is from state_barbell, and he asks, how do tapering strategies differ when you're using more of a high intraset fatigue method versus a low intraset fatigue method?
Yeah, so before I get to this question, I just want to be clear. I had a vague understanding of what question one was about. I understood that it was about tapering, but beyond that, I have no idea what we're about to talk about, so don't hold me to too high of a standard. So yeah, in terms of tapering for low versus more high fatigue type training blocks, I think what we've observed is that if you do kind of this low fatigue type style going into a taper and a test, you typically don't need as dramatic of a taper, or at least on average, right? So we kind of view that reduction in intercept fatigue from the low fatigue strategies as being what dissipates the fatigue for a lot of people. And then the final taper can just be a little bump. So for me personally, if every set is RP8 or above, I can benefit from 3 to 5 week tapers. Whereas on more of like a low fatigue type strategy, 1.5 week step taper and I'm good to go. So that's the general, heuristic that I think the listener can take away with that.
Cool. All right. First question for myself from Wolfpack Strength. Is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy relevant to strength, and does it allow for more myofibular hypertrophy? Well, I think the first most evidence-based answer here is we have no idea. So that's the very first thing to say. I think obviously Dr. Cody Hahn is going to be the man on this topic. Particularly, a lot of his research is what comes to mind when I'm thinking through this question. Just going through like with my gut answer, again, this is not totally evidence-based just because we have so little research in this area. I would say that based on what I think at the moment, I think sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is a kind of an outlier in the sense that it only seems to be elicited in pretty particular circumstances. Like I think the one training study we do have, at least one of the recent ones, there's older ones, but from Dr. Hahn was a really, really high volume training program. So that's kind of one instance. It's kind of, I think they worked up to like 32 sets of 10 or something pretty insane. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. But I think there was another study by Van from the same lab group that showed between kind of more typical high load versus moderate load training, there really didn't seem to be much evidence of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So if I had to guess, I think it's probably a preparatory change before we see kind of myofibular growth. So I don't necessarily think it's something we need to target at the current moment in time. And I don't necessarily think it's going to like potentiate more myofibular hypertrophy necessarily. It's just probably something that might need to happen prior to that, just part of the spectrum of change. But once again, that's totally just my gut answer. Not a ton of evidence there. Excited to see more research on it, but that's where I'm throwing my gut on that. Josh, anything to add on that?
Yeah, super quickly. I echo what you said. I would just say I hope that there is like some cool periodization that could eventually come about of this.
For sure.
So I'm holding out that there is some sort of like super cool potentiation between these two different quote unquote mechanisms of hypertrophy. That would
So
just be cool.
the one thing I'd say, just to make it super practical in terms of like kind of what I was saying, I've heard Dr. Hahn mention kind of explaining it like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is like building the house, but then myofibular hypertrophy is like putting furniture in it. So that's probably along the lines of what I think is kind of happening. Is it may just be a preparatory change in order to actually have the stuff that we want. But another thing is one more thing. Sorry. a lot of people call like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy non-functional hypertrophy. I think that'd be probably be a mistake because it does have a function. It just probably isn't for like strength and power. So I think that's like another thing to keep in mind is like it's not like
Ju-
just this goop that does nothing. Like there's a purpose to it. It just might not be generally for what we're concerned with. So yeah,
just to be clear for the listener, when you say preparatory, you're saying it's likely preparatory, but it's not like you have to go out of your way to do this
correct.
preparation.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, that okay. This is getting a pretty terrible lightning round, but we'll cut it there. Okay, Josh, would you ever find a use of shorter training cycles versus like 12-week ones to find a sweet spot for individual variables faster? So, would a shorter training cycle instead of a longer one allow you to kind of decrease your unit of training to individualize things faster? Is kind of how I interpreted that. It's from Grover
Yeah.
SBD.
Yeah. So I'm assuming, so that's Alex Grover, who's a good dude. So I, I'm guessing he listened to our podcast called the individualization process. And we kind of talked about, okay, we need like a unit of training we're individualizing within. And our kind of starting point is typically 12 weeks. Um, in that in that ballpark, because it's long enough that you can actually tell whether progress is is occurring, but it's also short enough that you know you don't have to, it's not 6 years later that you actually test and retest some things. So um it's a give and a take, and right now I think 12 weeks is a pretty good starting point, because at the end of the day, if you've been training for multiple years, making detectable progress in 6 to 8 weeks is just it just kind of becomes tough in my experience to actually say whether this training cycle was successful or not. Could you come to the conclusion that for you it's more like 9 or 10 weeks? Totally. I would really need convinced that it would be like below 9 weeks. Um, Again, I still kind of sit at 12 weeks being a good starting point, but I could be convinced to bump that down a little bit.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I'm not supposed to have anything to add. I think it's really just we've talked about this before, and even when we've talked to Mike T before, like it really just comes down to determining what you value more in your kind of your training unit that you ultimately utilize. But yeah, um, okay, next one. I'll take this one. This one's from Jordy Lifts. What is your opinion on EMG studies? When are they useful and when not? So I was thinking about this one, and when I saw it come through, like I said, I didn't write an answer down or anything, but I think this is actually developing to be a more interesting question for me because of some of the recent stuff on long muscle lengths, particularly. So there, if you recall, Josh, there was like there was an EMG study that looked at that, and it kind of predicted what happened when we saw this new longitudinal study from Mako and colleagues, seeing that hamstring activation was a little bit greater at longer muscle lengths. So to me, that kind of confirmed that they aren't completely useless for sure, and they can tell us some things, but it's just when the methods are appropriately controlled. Like there's a really good review paper by Vygotsky that goes through all the different things that can affect EMG, what it's actually measuring, subcutaneous fat, all this kind of stuff. And so when those methods are properly controlled, then it can be pretty useful and seems to predict outcomes in sometimes. But I also wouldn't use it to like hang my hat on like exactly how you would design training. Like most things in research, I would use those studies as probably like idea fuel, and then use the individual outcomes that you actually have when implementing the ideas in your own training to further solidify if it's a good idea or not. So overall answer, I think when they're well controlled, they can sometimes predict outcomes for the things we want to know. But at the same time, a lot of them aren't appropriately controlled, and so I wouldn't hang my hat on them and like throw PubMed links at people like you're some kind of god or something. So that would be my kind of 2 cents there.
I'm really resisting going down a rabbit hole. Um, I just I will say that anytime I interpret a study where the primary outcome is EMG or it's an additional thing they looked at, I'm just like super cautious,
Mhm.
because largely this is just a lack of confidence in my understanding of it. And I think even the people that, you know, are kind of have the best understanding in the world and how this should apply to resistance training, they're also like, hey, this is, this stuff really needs to be interpreted with caution. So I'm just always super, super cautious. And like you said, Zach, I think idea fuel is a great way to think about it.
Yep.
Like, for example, this reminds me of a passage from the book Endure by Alex Hutchinson. Um, and I think it's interesting, in that book, he kind of talks about the different mechanisms of fatigue for like shorter duration bouts of exercise versus like longer duration bouts of exercise. And when you see a divergence in EMG activity, and I believe it's like maximum voluntary isometric contraction strength, when you see a divergence of those two versus when they can converge, that can kind of give you an insight into the mechanism of fatigue. We don't need to go through the whole explanation of that, but again, it's like it's idea fuel, but it's just like I'm going to take a massive grain of salt. I'm going to take this with a massive grain of salt. So,
Yeah, I
uh,
think I think EMG kind of reminds me, like when I hear, like you said, the people that are really familiar with using it in the lab. To be very clear, neither Josh or I has ever done research with EMG, but they kind of talk about it similar to how I think we talk about measuring velocity loss. It's just super finicky. Like there's just a ton of things you have to get exactly right for the readings to tell you what you want to know. So like when I hear people kind of talk about it and like the meticulousness you need to have in order to extract the information that you actually want, I think it reminds me when we talk about stuff like that. So just like you said, a ton of caution, and I think ideal fuel is probably the best way to do that. But going to the next question, this one's for you, Josh. Matt, last name is with a Z, and there's a lot of I's, and I'm not going to try, but Matt, thanks for the question. He just said flywheel training, and I'm assuming that is asking you about flywheel training in the context of that we usually discuss for max strength and muscle growth.
So this is I was not lying. I've not seen these questions and I'm not prepared for this one. So my answer is interesting. I need to look into it. It's been something I've been wanting to look into, but I haven't.
Okay.
But it looks interesting. And I've done one set on a flywheel. It was a bicep curl. It was at this like convention like 4 or 5 years ago. And my biceps were sore for like a week. So
Okay.
that's about all the insight I have right now.
So I'll translate this to you and see if you get a slightly more in depth answer. It's essentially the idea of matching the resistance and strength curves. What do you think about that?
My interpretation of the research right now is neutral to very small benefit if that's the case. So there is a potential for it to be a negative if you like accidentally mess it up and all of a sudden it's not difficult at a long muscle length. So when the muscle is at its most lengthened position throughout the range of motion, I have a hard time believing there would be a downside to matching the resistance profile to the strength profile, just because, um, like again, I just don't really see a downside. But I don't know, Zach. Does anything come to your?
I think like because the two things that kind of come to mind with this just topic in general is like it's usually talked about with accommodating resistance, right? But the way that accommodating resistance works, it's like pretty pretty different throughout the entire rep. But flywheel training, to my understanding, kind of matches it at every single segmental point throughout the rep. So I feel like that would be really solid. But like you said, I have never used one, and the eccentric load sounds like it's pretty brutal. So that might be something I'd have to experience myself before I make super confident conclusions. But in theory, I think
Is
flywheel training makes maybe a little bit more sense than like accommodating resistance in theory. But I could be totally wrong about that. I'd have to think about it more.
Yeah, my understanding of how the flywheel works is not rock solid, so that's kind of limiting my ability to comment on this. Um, because I think the eccentric force you have to overcome is, or essentially you have to, the eccentric force you have to produce is based on the concentric force you just produced.
Yeah,
So I'd have to think through it more.
yeah.
I'm
I
really
don't
not.
know.
I'm really not sure.
Interesting, Matt. Um,
Thanks for the question.
yeah, it was a good question, man. Okay. So, what is your opinion on splitting a single workout and doing it as 2 to 3 parts a day to manage fatigue? So, should you do 2 or 3 day, 3 a day training? First of all, I think if you're asking a question about 3 days. You got a lot of time to train, man. So that's Ashraf, who is in our IP group. So good, thanks for the question, man. Um, a lot of time to train, first of all, so that's pretty cool. But I think I do not know the two-a-day training literature very well at all to have an intelligent answer here. But I think going with the logical answer, which obviously can get you in trouble sometimes. I think, if you have more than one time a day to train, like I guess the frequency literature wouldn't be super helpful here because higher frequencies seem to help a little bit, but not a ton. So having the same amount of work in a less fatigued state theoretically could help. But I think the main thing that comes to mind for me is like if splitting your training up into 2 or 3 times a day can help you psychologically to like come into part of your training with a better mentality. I think that theoretically could have an advantage. But yeah, I don't know if I have too many strong thoughts on it. Honestly, I've never done 2 a day or 3 a day training myself. Some people have really good anecdotes with that, but yeah, I don't know if I have too much to add there, Josh.
Yeah, I would just say the question was framed around fatigue management. I think that would fatigue me more. I could see doing like a 2 a day and making one of the sessions like super easy where you don't have to like warm up a ton, like just go do like some single joint exercises. Um, but for most people, like typically I'm trying to make sure their training isn't too long. So usually that's where my head is going.
Yep.
And like, hey, this person now can only train 3 times a week or now can only train 4 times a week. So that's typically where my head is at. I haven't experimented with 2 times a day training myself. Um, so yeah, I would just say from a fatigue management perspective, I can't think of a strong rationale off the top of my head. The rationale for 2 a day training would primarily be to increase the quality of the training volume
Right.
you're completing,
Yeah.
right? So that's going to be pretty individual. For me personally, I don't think that would be the case because I would just be more
Me,
rushed,
me either.
right? Because
Yeah.
I wouldn't have the time. But it'll be pretty individual, and I have a hard time believe like I would just experiment with it if you have the time.
Cool. Next one. Stephen Fowler asks, what are the differences, if any, you recommend applying velocity based training data to the deadlift versus the other two lifts?
Oh, that's a really really good question. So I'm blanking on the first author, and I'm also blanking on the year of the study, but the I'm aware of a study looking at deadlift velocity loss in the deadlift,
Spaniard?
and yeah, maybe. And
Pretty
if
sure.
they report the average velocity of each repetition across the set, and until you get to the last few reps, it's like really finicky. Like some reps are faster than the others. But the issue with that is in the manuscript, if I recall correctly, I don't think they mentioned whether or not they rested the bar on the ground between reps. So with the deadlift, you'll see some people, if they don't rest the bar on the ground between reps, um, like the second, third, fourth reps can be faster than the first rep because you have the benefit of the stretch reflex, whereas on the first rep you don't. So I would say make dang sure that you are resting 3 or 4 seconds or more between reps. Um, Beyond that, I don't have a strong reason to believe that velocity would be less useful if you're doing that, but I'm not sure if you're aware of any reason, Zach.
No, I would just say, just based, this is totally based on my personal experience. This is why typically I tend to favor, if you're going to take a velocity based approach, I would tend to favor singles for top sets on deadlifts on average, just because the repeatability of the relationship between repetitions in terms of velocity, I think, is a little bit more accurate day to day. So that's maybe a practical consideration of like if you're gonna base your top set load prescription on velocity for the deadlift, maybe something to consider to primarily use singles, which is obviously more specific as well, and particularly for the deadlift, like Josh said, because you're not getting that stretch reflex on the second, third, fourth repetitions. So I think that's one thing to consider. But other than that, yeah, I think it's, as long as you are setting the bar on the ground, letting the stretch reflex dissipate, I don't see why it would be less useful in theory. So I would agree. Um,
I would also add one more thing is that if you're doing multi-rep top sets, you can also just look at the first rep velocity. That's actually what I did a while back when I was pretty meticulously tracking top set velocities. Is I would just log the first rep velocity and kind of use that as my gauge, due to some of that, that confounder with the deadlift specifically. Um, there's something else I was going to say, but it's escaping me. So let's go to the next question.
cool. Engelman Alexander, who asks a ton of good questions on our stuff, asks thoughts on interleaving close variations with competition movements. Now, this is a really interesting question. For maybe a little bit of background, there's like some motor learning research that seems to suggest when you take a bench press, for example, and you split up your bench press volume, throwing darts between sets instead of just resting, that seems to improve strength or skill acquisition. And so the thought there is that by interleaving the competition variance with something like a pause squat or a tempo squat, so like you do a competition rep and then you do like a pause rep, the idea is you can further augment motor learning to a certain degree. Now, once again, no idea in terms of an evidence based answer here. I think it's a super, super interesting idea in practice. I've never really tried it myself, but I think from a larger perspective, I do think this has some merit in terms of why I would say a lot of people that are like kind of training for strength ports in today's day and age at least include some variation. I do think there's just value to like, having those slight different skills that you're working on, pause squat, tempo squat. In my experience, they allow you to feel like different positional changes and different things you can work on. So I definitely think from a large scale perspective, I like to include some variation in most of the programs I write and perform myself, just because I think that does anecdotally seem to help with skill acquisition. Now, doing that within the same session or even within the same set, does that further augment that effect? Like I said, I don't really know. I would say the only thing that would be difficult here is like from a tracking and effort perspective, it might get a little weird if you're like doing like a really long pause squat in between a competition set. What load should you use? All that kind of thing. Obviously, you could just use RP and kind of base it just consistently. But I do think there'd probably be a little bit of a logistical consideration there from tracking and load prescription. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea and concept. So I would say maybe give it a shot, see how it goes, and report back. I think that's a pretty cool idea. Makes sense in theory.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, if you are going to try this out, rate don't rate how you think it went based on how the performance feels within the session, because when you're doing something like this, this is what's called in the literature high contextual interference. And within the training session, your performance will probably be worse, but at a retention test later, your motor retention or your motor skill may be higher than a lower contextual interference. So if you were to just do regular squats as opposed to interleaving pin squats and regular squats. So don't rate the effectiveness or just your intuition about how things are going based on how that session itself is going, because that's the idea, is you're trying to make it harder for yourself, and you're basically forcing yourself to relearn the motor pattern you want to get better at, which is the regular squat, more often, which will more likely transfer that motor task to long term memory. So, just something I wanted to add in here. It's actually a super interesting topic. I would also suggest checking out an article on our website written by our friend
Shout out Nate.
Nate, our friend Nate, about exercise variation in powerlifting. And there's a few, I believe, at the end of the article, a few practical strategies that might be of interest.
Yeah, to be clear, we had a long argument about one paper in specifically, and I lost that battle miserably. So just shout out to Nate and Josh for keeping me sane.
I don't remember the exact topic, but I just remember the victory.
Yeah, that's all that
Feels good.
matters. Cool. So next question from Mr. Bartis. How much gains am I leaving on the table if I don't do any exercises above 15 reps? I am presuming this is about muscle growth.
Probably none. You're probably going to be fine. Man, this is actually something I'm not sure. Zach, are you ever aware of any research showing a lack of a benefit or a particular benefit to intermixing different rep ranges?
Schoenfeld
Nothing's come.
study.
Do you remember the broad
I
design of
believe
that?
I believe they had it was 20 to 25 RM included, and the other one I think just did 8 to 12. I want to say, but that's just off the top of my head.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Zach, what do you what do you think, man?
Um, yeah, I mean, if we're just going straight gut answers, I don't think you're necessarily leaving anything on the table. Um, you could spec like some people have speculated in the literature. I don't particularly hold this position, but some people have speculated um, very low loads and thus high repetition sets may preferentially hypertrophy type 1 fibers. I don't think the evidence is particularly strong for that personally, but some people have made that case. And then you could also, coming back to one of the earlier questions we mentioned, some people would suggest that those higher repetition, longer duration sets would probably are more likely to stimulate those sarcoplasmic hypertrophic effects, which again, we don't know if that matters in the long run at all. But if it does, that theoretically might matter in that case. But yeah, if you're asking me today, I would say don't. That's definitely not what I would worry about too much. I find a rep range you'd enjoy for hypertrophy, push it for a while, try to progress within that rep range, and then if things start getting stale, you can switch things up. But I don't think there's necessarily a need to go over a certain amount of reps
So
personally.
now I'm remembering a slightly related area of literature that I am kind of aware of is like I want to say it. I want to say Schoenfeld was the lead author, but I'm not sure if he was the lead author or if he was just on the paper. Um, there's a review paper speculating the potential additive effects of blood flow resistance
Yeah.
training
Mhm.
with just traditional resistance training. And in short, we don't know yet. There's conflicting evidence. Um, so yeah, I mean, I know I said this earlier, but probably a neutral to slightly positive effect to including some sort of higher rep ranges if your goal is solely hypertrophy. And to be clear, I would also add that it's not inherently the rep range. It's more about how you're getting to effective hypertrophy training. And the way that I'd like to do that in practice is including like myo-rep protocols. So I'll kind of mix that up here and there for clients interested in hypertrophy outcomes is including some myo reps for arm work or for back work. But for like a power lifter interested in getting better at squat, bench, deadlift, I'm not giving myo reps on those. Maybe I'll sprinkle in some cluster sets on leg extensions if they're the type of person that likes to train to failure, that kind of thing. So um, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. Neutral to slightly positive effect of intermixing some, more metabolically fatiguing training. Um, but I wouldn't go crazy chasing after it.
Cool. Next one, I'm definitely going to mispronounce the name. I'm going to go with Gisli Johannesson. Probably wrong. Sorry. I tried my best. But
Nailed
they
it.
asked how to decide how much volume to do to build muscle. So, obviously, a pretty big question here. I think by and large, the things you want to focus on is I would say start with less than you think you need. I would say definitely the first thing I would focus on, particularly for hypertrophy, is dialing in your intensity of effort. And I think you can honestly do this with like if you were going to have 2 sessions per muscle group, I would even like focus with one really solid exercise, like a leg press or something like that, and just work on using one set until you have progressed load enough. And obviously start gradually and start pretty light until you get to that set to like a no joke 9 or 10 RP. Then you know that you've anchored from an intensity of effort perspective. And then from there, if you want to add in some additional volume per session and throughout the week, I think that's a safe bet to do so, so long as you are subjectively recovering, meaning you don't feel too beat up. And you feel like you're able to actually put forth adequate effort every training session, and then also keep an eye on your performance and make sure that that is not tanking due to being just way overly fatigued. Now, obviously, that's a very, very large oversimplification, but I think That's kind of the mental model I work within. And then you're essentially trying to do enough volume to progress for hypertrophy. You could argue that doing a little bit more until you see kind of a stagnation in performance might be a little bit of an advantage, but in my mind, I would stick with a moderate amount of volume that allows you to progress. When you are incapable of progressing, make sure you've taken deloads. Then maybe consider adding somewhere around 20% of weekly set volume from there to see if you can continue to progress and kind of make those modifications as necessary. And as I said, if you feel beat up and over fatigued, probably take a step back. How'd I do?
Got nothing to add, so good enough.
Sweet. Okay. Block periodization versus concurrent training in the long run for powerlifting. That's from ooh, Jed and Seri. That's also
So,
wrong.
so the question is block periodization versus concurrent.
Training for in the long run for powerlifting is the question. Yep.
So just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so like option A would be, or let me take a step back. The question is basically asking if you're including some sort of endurance training
No, no, no,
alongside
no.
powerlifting training.
I believe it's a periodization question. So
Concurrent
concurrent
meaning strength and
periodization.
hypertrophy.
Yeah. So like block periodization, just very simply to define it for the listeners too. Like super oversimplified, but like generally it's like a block where you're only focusing on muscular endurance, then a block where you're only focused on muscle hypertrophy, then a block where you're only focused on strength, and then finish on with like a block when you're only focused on power. Whereas concurrent periodization would be where you're kind of trying to work on all those qualities simultaneously. There may be a different kind of weight to one to another depending on the sport, but you're kind of including aspects of those qualities throughout the training cycle.
Okay, perfect. When I hear concurrent, I always just my head
Yeah,
goes to
yeah.
combining endurance training. So, um, the first thing I would say is that they're not mutually exclusive, right? So, sometimes people will say, "Oh, is the DUP better than this traditional periodization model?" Whereas really, they're not they're not mutually exclusive. So you can have a undulating programming scheme within the week, but then that still kind of follow a linear pattern. So that's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say is, if you kind of made me pick, I would go more towards a concurrent approach for sure, and just kind of shift the bias. So kind of in our like a standard training cycle, I would write it'll have a hypertrophy focus phase and a strength focus phase. But I always tell people like it's just a slight shift in emphasis, right? So like I would, if I had to put a number on it during those strength phases, I would say the hypertrophy stimulus is 90 to 95% of what it was before. And also during those hypertrophy phases, we're going to be touching pretty heavy top sets. I always say I don't want you to have to relearn how to, do a pretty heavy squat. So I would definitely lean more towards the concurrent approach. We often talk about doing a lot of good hypertrophy training for the prime movers for the main lifts. Um, and I think a lot of people's knee jerk reaction to something like that is, oh, you're doing a bunch of sets of H12 for 8 weeks, and then you're going into your strength training. But no, it's like, okay, we're just going to sacrifice a little bit on the top sets, um, and we're going to really make sure our execution and our effort is going towards these hypertrophy friendly movements. But again, we're still doing those top sets, so it's really, I would definitely lean more towards the concurrent approach, at least for a strength athlete.
Nothing to add there. Um, Engelman Alexander has another good question here. He asked, "How much hype should be used in training?" So I think this is an interesting question. I think the first thing to say is that it's going to be extremely individual, and I think kind of the recommendations that we make generally should be looked at to be relative to whatever your normative level of arousal is. So like, you know, some people are just the type of people that really enjoy to train with a lot of external hype, yelling, screaming, ammonia. Whereas some other people are a little bit more reserved and may have a lot of internal arousal, but it maybe is just a little bit less external. So I think when we talk about hype in training, I think it should always be relative to what you are habituated to. So in my mind, uh, hype definitely I would say, especially in the context that we're usually discussing this, which is like powerlifting or strength sports, that's usually going to be associated with your top sets most of the time. And what we observe for the most part is when you get really, really hyped up for your top set, it may acutely increase your performance, but often that is accompanied by a pretty big drop off in your ability to produce effort for the rest of the training session. So if you go, you go ammonia, crackhead hype for your top set, and you maybe are able to add, 5 to 15 kilos on the bar extra because of that. That's awesome, and that may be good for a meet environment or a competition or a test day. But when you go to do your, your couple back off sets or your hypertrophy work afterwards, often we see a pretty significant drop in effort that may ultimately compromise the quality of that work, which in like a hypertrophy focus phase would be, as Josh said in the last question, probably where we want a good amount of our effort allocated towards. So in hypertrophy focus phase, I'd probably dial back that hype, especially on top sets a little bit to make sure that the quality of the overall volume of the training session is really, really high. And you can really put forth most of that effort in achieving adequate proximity to failure on most of your sets. For a strength focus phase, I'd probably like linearly periodized hype as you get closer to competition, and then maybe taper it just like you would volume. So like the closer you get to competition, you probably want to be a little bit more familiar with the increase in arousal, because that can cause some people to get really out of control if they haven't done it in a while. So I think increasing the level of arousal that you allow yourself closer to competition probably makes a little bit more sense. And then during meet week, you don't want to be maxing out on Monday when you have a meet that Saturday. So just like you would taper volume, probably taper back your hype the last week or two before competition, so that you can really reproduce it on meet day. So that would be kind of my general guidelines. And anything to add?
All good.
Okay, so last one, last one. This is a really good question. I figured we could talk about this one for a little bit. Jacob Weimer asked, future powerlifting related research you'd like to see. So if you're designing a study today, Josh, you have all the funding in the world, all the resources. I guess you can throw a little bit of logistics in there if you want, but let's be fun. What would you like to see?
Oh man, I feel like I need to give a really good answer to the I'm not ready for that. Throughout this whole podcast, while I've been giving my answers, I've been seeing you looking at the future questions, kind of just
No,
preparing. So
no, I'm
I've
not
been at a
preparing.
disadvantage.
I'm looking for the next one to make sure I throw you a good one.
Okay, thanks, man. Um, I'll answer more generally, and then we'll see if some awesome study design idea comes up. But I think, well, something we talked about in this podcast was combining, kind of more mechanical like stimuli to something like blood flow restriction and seeing if that improves outcomes, if there is an additive effect. That's an idea that comes to mind. Another idea, and I think that this is something that can really, a potential thing that could really change the way we train in the long term, is figuring out a way to look into this resensitization question a lot more. So a limitation of a lot of studies is their duration. And if this applying some resensitization concepts to multi-year training plans, which we don't necessarily advise against right now, or we don't necessarily advise you do that right now, but I could see that potentially happening if we learn stuff about you know how reduced training stress can potentiate the effectiveness of future training, and also kind of changing the different type of training and how that potentiates future outcomes as well. So similar to the blood flow restriction stuff and the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy discussions we talked about, maybe it does make sense for somebody that's been training for 10 years to spend 3 months really training like that, and that's going to potentiate future gains. That would be awesome, and that would really be a game changer. And I could see that being the case, but it's just something it's going to be really hard to put our finger on the pulse of that right now. So, yeah, that's where my head goes right now.
Yeah, I think the thing that mostly comes to my mind, and I think we've talked about this before, is it's like one of the major limitations of research is that we're usually looking at the averages, right? And it's pretty well known at this point that the training response to like a given program in research is going to be super varied, which isn't surprising. Um, but I think one thing that'd be really helpful from a practical perspective as a coach is you know when we do these training programs, taking a bunch of these practical measurements that a coach potentially could have access to and seeing if there is any correlation with this individual needs high volume, low volume, close proximity to failure, far from proximity to failure, high loads, low loads. All those questions is like we know there's so much variation um, in response to every single one of those variables. But from a tool set perspective, right now it's just like, yep, individual variation exists, but there's no real way to kind of tease out a practical place to start. So you kind of are just relying on a athlete's past training history, which is obviously useful, and then just kind of your intuition as a coach to some degree, and going by the averages. But I think one thing I always consider is like, especially as coaches, I think a lot of the time you are have a self-selected population of people who are probably more likely to be outliers than the average response, because if they weren't, they probably wouldn't be seeking out coaching, and because anything that was just the kind of the average training program would work for them. So that's always something I consider too. But yeah, I would just like to see like where maybe we have a crossover design or within subjects design for hypertrophy, for example, putting them through these different types of training protocols, mixing up volumes, proximity to failure, loads, and just seeing if any of these practical measurements, like, I don't know, counter movement jump, rep performance at 80% of 1RM, stuff like that, where it could be really easy to gather data as a coach to give you an indication on where to start with an athlete and just jumpstart the individualization process a little bit faster. That's kind of, yeah, that's probably my answer. But I don't know if you got a second idea, Josh. I'll try to think of another one.
Yeah, so there was a kind of going along what you were saying. There's a study from like the first quarter, or maybe like midway through 2020. I think it came out looking at um, different rep ranges and how that might influence training outcomes. But the let's see here, the title of the study is, do the anatomical and physiological properties of a muscle determine its adaptive response to different loading protocols? So I just remember from reading this paper when it came out that there were just massive individual differences in responses to different rep ranges. I want to say it's for the calves. I might have these
That,
studies
that,
mixed up, but
that sounds right.
yeah, so just like figuring out some of that stuff and these individual differences I think are massive. And I think the longer we work with individuals, the more we see these people on the ends of the spectrum in terms of like what seems to work best for them. And just, I don't know, it'd be really nice to have a better starting point for a lot of those types of people. I've said this in other podcasts because, sometimes I'll kind of get a framework for a first training cycle with someone, and sometimes it'll go really well right off the bat. For other people, it might be training cycle number 5 or number 6 where the stars align and things start to work really well. And getting more and more people towards, hey, this first cycle is when things are going to really pick up. um, that would be awesome. And I think right now, by having a systematic individualization process, you can get there. It's just you're sacrificing some of that training time. And our job as coaches is to get someone there as soon as possible. But again, getting away, whether that's the general bias of rep ranges, training dose, proximity to failure, all this stuff that kind of goes into the training design. If we could have a better starting point, I think that would be a game changer. But that's now the pessimism comes in that's just so many years away, but is exciting nonetheless.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't think I have another one. I think that's a good place to shut her down here today. Once again, thank you for everyone tuning in to the podcast. I think I like this format, Josh. I don't know. I don't know if you did. I probably benefited from having the questions, so might have to switch the roles around for next time. But yeah, I had a good time doing this one. So uh, general things, if you enjoyed the show, go ahead, give us a 5-star rating and review on the appropriate places to do so. Also, be sure to submit a question for a future show on the Google form, if you would like to see us discuss something. I think that is starting to. We need some more questions. I'll put it that way. So make sure you submit your questions if you got anything you'd like to see us discuss, and then also
And
be sure to
that's in the description of the podcast.
description of the podcast. Yes. And then also it's in our link trees on Instagram, I believe. And then finally, if you'd like to learn more about our individualized programming products, be sure to check that out in the description as well. Been really, really cool to see people start finishing up their first cycles and hit some PRs. So check that out if you would like to learn more. So without further ado, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.